Hi, and welcome to part 2 of the Twice Exceptional Learners with ASD webcast series. Part 2 is on identifying and supporting academic needs of students. I'm Josh Taylor. This is my colleague Staci Carr from the VCU Autism Center for Excellence. If you missed part 1, I would encourage you to go back and check that out. That really covers a lot of the social and behavioral strategies that are related to this. But here in part 2, we're going to go over a brief recap of executive functioning. Something that kind of underpins a lot of the aspects that we're talking about today. We'll go over some organizational skills and strategies that can be used with students, as well as strategies that can support more specific academic skills in reading, writing, and math, as well as just general overview of some kind of planning organization skills that are helpful with students that are related to some of the common breakdowns that students have. So again, a review, executive functioning really describes the set of cognitive processes and skills that are used to plan, organize, and execute different tasks. And so the metaphor that I like to think about is that air traffic controller. And so it's not really flying the plane, it's not building the plane, but really it's integral to making sure that flights arrive and leave on time, and can operate efficiently within the structure of kind of an airport situation. So the air traffic controller is not there. Maybe people are still able to get in and out of the airport, but it's going to happen a lot more slowly because pilots, are having to sort of look and gauge and sort of land one at a time without that fluid process. So this is sort of not a specific process or a specific skill, but really is a coordination of skills.
Right.
Yeah.
And some of those skills, which we addressed in part 1, are that metacognition. And so these are the things that we don't see, but is all in our brain that we use in order to make sure that things are happening, that we're initiating work tasks when they need to be, that we have things on our working memory that we can pull from in certain situations based on past experiences. And it's our way of being able to plan and organize and self-monitor our behavior and our work plan. So, you have a list of things that need to get done and being able to understand timelines and when things should happen in what order in order to be successful in those academics. The other piece is that behavioral motion control. And that's, we talked a lot about that in part 1, but it's that being able to shift from one task to another, from one situation to another, that thought process that in this situation I behave in this way, and in this other situation I can behave in a different way. It's being able to know how to deal with inhibition, knowing when to kind of put up some barriers so that you don't do things that are inappropriate, but also when you can let those guards down. And being able to manage and self-regulate. And again, in part 1, we talked a lot about that. So we're going to shift to those organizational skills first. And I work with a lot of students from early elementary through high school and college. And across the board, organizational skills are some of those things that without them, the academics can really fall apart. So you can be as bright as can be in a specific subject or all subjects, but if you can't organize your those tasks, those things that you have to do for the class, then you're not reaching your full potential, and you're really going to struggle. So some of the things with that metacognition is recalling from past experiences, from past events, from past classes. So you may have had world history in 7th or 8th grade, but then you're going to take it in high school, and being able to understand that some of those things that you may have learned in the past and pulling them from back then into the current situation. Paying attention, I often hear that it doesn't look like a person with autism is paying attention in class. And it may look different for different people, and sometimes if I'm paying attention, I'm not necessarily looking at a person, but I can still make sure that I'm mentally attending and taking in the information and monitoring. So if I do start to get a little bit off task or start thinking about something else, I can shift my focus back to whatever academic task is at hand. And then some of that flexibility and problem solving. So if you're working on a task in school and perhaps you're working in a small group and knowing that, oh, I have this piece, but I need this other piece in order to make my part of this puzzle work. What are some of the problem solving strategies that you can do if that piece is not there to support yours? So, maybe Josh and I are working on a project together and he doesn't have my part to move forward. So instead of just sitting there and not doing anything, he could ask me for my part. He could ask if I need help doing my part so that it moves the process forward. Time management and prioritizing. I know that we have we have to do this every day in work, and so do students. And knowing that there are a variety of things that have to get done, and making sure that you're putting the things that are biggest priority ahead of the things that might be more fun or that might be a little bit faster to do.
Yeah. And so I think kind of looking at this list, we can think as teachers about a couple common situations that come up across subjects that we're going to need to be mindful to provide a little bit more support and to sort of kind of plan to come up with a plan ahead of time for students, and sort of that group work that Staci talked about. So anytime we're going to have to negotiate with other people and find a role and problem solve those situations, we may need to approach that ahead of time and prime students for what's going to happen, be more explicit about those roles than maybe we'd give to a typical class or a typical group of students. Longer term projects that are going to have maybe one big deadline 3 months out, we may need to chunk that a little bit more and to provide some more incremental steps to get there. And then also, it's become very popular in a lot of classes right now to do a little bit more deep thinking and more Socratic kind of conversational methods of getting students to really engage with content in a different way, which are great. But for some of our students, that kind of making those facts more abstract can be a little bit of a challenge. And so might need a little bit more support, guidance, a little bit more structure to sort of unpack those ideas that are in there, but articulating them on the fly in a more verbal way may be a bit more challenging. So just being mindful as going through this list that Staci's mentioned about when these things might pop up and how we might respond.
One of my favorite strategies are lists. And I know that we have plenty of lists that we use throughout our life. And if you think about it, you have lists at work, you have, if you're in school still, you have lists for school, you have lists for the grocery store. If you go to the grocery store and you don't have a list, you get tons of things that weren't even on the list, and you forget half the things that were on the list. So we make lists all the time, and it's a nice tool that's easy to do. You can do it on the fly. There's apps, remind apps and list making apps. So these are tools that can be used very early on that can carry a person throughout environments and their different aspects of their life. So teaching them how to make lists and use them effectively is important. So how did you learn how to make lists?
Good question. I think I've dealt with not having a list for a long time,
Right.
and then people got very frustrated with me, and then at some point somebody shoved a list in my face and said, made one of these. But then over time I learned how to make it more a part of my organizational system, and I started using it more for work and more for school, and found that really helped me to overcome some of the issues I had with forgetting things and not breaking things down, and now I use them all the time.
I agree the same way. I remember my mom making grocery lists, and I thought, well, why does she need to do that? And so then as I got older, I realized, oh, so you're planning so that it takes less time when you're at the grocery store, which is a really great thing. So if a list can streamline your process and help students not get stuck in the weeds or spend too long on a certain task, then I think making lists are very appropriate. So that's one of our strategies.
Agreed. So reading. So I think, if you've worked very long with students with autism, you've probably come across the kiddo that reading decoding skills are off the charts, 99th percentile. They have a vocabulary at a collegiate level. And then it comes to reading comprehension and something breaks down. The reading comprehension just isn't on that same level. It's a common kind of area with a splinter skill and an area that needs a little bit more support for students with autism. But I think we don't often talk about sort of the why of that and what we can do about it. So spend a little time on that today. So I think the why of it, when we talked about a little bit more in part one, that idea of central cohesion as an element of executive functioning. And so central cohesion is that ability to make a forest out of trees, or to pull out those little details to make a big picture of what does this mean overall. So I might know what each individual word is and be able to give you the definition of the etymology and the pronunciation, but if I can't put those ideas together in a bigger picture as part of, especially when you get into the later grades, those kind of longer fictional narratives or very connected and dense academic texts, if I'm not able to kind of do this cognitive process, then that meaning is never going to, my ability to create meaning out of text is just not going to get there. And then we also think about, in fiction, the characters. As in the same way as in social situations, that inability to take perspectives of others comes out and has a big impact in these situations. It's the same in a piece of fiction. And if we're not able to make certain intuitive jumps about what characters might think and feel and do in certain situations, we're missing out on a lot of what fiction really, how it operates. And then obviously, with the figurative and higher order language, in the same way that idioms can be a challenge, they appear all the time and are a big part of text as well. So, a lot of what we do is to provide some structure and really break down some of these things. So you can see a graphic organizer here in the picture that really helps to pull those details to create more of a meaning or show how ideas are connected within a text. And these can be really helpful ways that students can learn to start to create a network of how ideas work together in a text themselves. And within the character identification, thinking about how theory of mind really plays a role, and how we can start to show, we talked about cartooning in the previous webcast, about kind of showing how characters are thinking and feeling in different situations, and even having some scaffolding or having a structure to keep track of characters and who is doing what, and really breaking down kind of what their motivations are, what their situation is, and that can help to pull together some of those social dynamics that are really fundamental to a lot of fiction texts, even at younger levels, that our guys might not make those connections.
One of the pieces of that is that making the self-to-text connections. Mm-hmm. And so really being able to put yourself in the character's in the character's role and realize what are their feelings, would you have the same feelings? And that sometimes will help with making a main idea or understanding why a person would act that way. And I think cartooning would be appropriate in this situation too. Mm-hmm. So if there's multiple characters in a text, using that cartooning to figure out, okay, this is how the main character acted, and this is how the supporting character acted, and this is why they felt this way. So that's a tool that bridges both areas. Mm-hmm.
And so we see here an example of sort of a connected piece of text with lots of different areas that can create challenges for students with autism, from sort of nonsense words and idioms to aspects of perspective taking and inferences that need to happen with the student. And then, when we also look at a chunk of text like this, I really want to highlight the role that metacognition plays in it. We've all been there where we're sitting on a beach, or we're sitting down with even a novel that we really enjoy and we're very engaged in, and we're sort of reading, and then we notice halfway down the page that we've sort of drifted off and sort of not comprehended or not even paid attention to the last page or two of the book we've been reading, and just sort of skimming through and looking at all the words without really making meaning of it. And that's metacognition in action right there. And so we can think about, if we don't have the metacognition to repair when we miss out on that meaning creation, and to reflect back on, this character said this, so how does that change what the dynamic is or what the meaning of a narrative is before that. If we're not able to make those jumps and to stop what we're doing to reflect back, then we're missing out on a lot of the comprehension. So there are a lot of good strategies that look at having students kind of go back to check, either by writing in the margins, sort of what's happening, what's being added to an overall story as the story goes along, or even picking out certain features within the text, like pronouns. So every time there's a pronoun, having the student go back and highlight what is that pronoun referring to.
That's great.
Because pronouns can refer to a lot of different things. It can be, depending on the context of a story, any number of things. And so having that as a place marker to do sort of what metacognition might do in a typical reader on their own can be really helpful at repairing that comprehension before it breaks down to the point that student has no idea what's going on in the text. So some helpful strategies to think about. Which takes us to writing. And so writing is, in some ways has a lot of the same challenges as reading. But we often don't think about teaching it explicitly enough, even for typical students, and really breaking down, what are the parts of it? How do we organize and plan for it? What's the purpose of writing? What's the audience of it? What do we really want to convey with what we're putting out there? And how do we want to choose language that is aligned with what the audience is, that meets the purpose, but is also sort of engaging and interesting and appropriate for the context of the writing itself. And so these are all things that are really difficult to pick out and might need a little bit more structuring and scaffolding on the front end to make sure that students can put these all together. So, again, graphic organizers and making more of an incremental process to this instead of just sort of having a prompt and having students jump right in, taking the time to learn how a student is best going to organize their planning, using sort of pre-made graphic organizers can be really good. With older students, it might be teaching them how to sort of break down and sort of write out their own prompts. So if it's for an SOL or an end-of-course writing sample, it might not be feasible to have a separate graphic organizer that a student brings in, but maybe having them sort of make their own graphic organizer or make their own sort of meaning map that sort of breaks down some of these ideas can be really, really helpful. It's also really important to consider assistive technology. So a lot of our students, twice exceptional students, have difficulty with fine motor skills, or their sort of writing can't keep up with what they're thinking, and so there's a breakdown there. And so making sure when you're part of an IEP team to consider assistive technology can really be helpful at working through some of those issues that impact writing. And can affect some of those other areas as well.
Right, and if it's truly about the writing and the content, then it shouldn't really matter if it's handwritten or if it's with word prediction software and a tablet or some sort of assistive technology.
Right. Yeah, and it's really important, I think, if we're going to use those in testing environments also, obviously, to make sure that we're introducing them ahead of time, we're using them in day-to-day classroom activities where we can support and kind of model and scaffold students' use of those tools as well. And then, we want to continue to provide a lot of rich structure through rubrics. Some good strategies are kind of writing, having students to write out or showing students how to pull out those important expectations for writing, whether it's kind of audience purpose, the kind of language we'll use, the level of formality. When we proofread and edit things, to go through and pick out one type of error at a time can be helpful, so that students don't get overwhelmed with looking for different types of things. So just...
I really like rubrics, and I think this gives students a clear, those expectations again. So you need to use figurative language. You have to use so many adjectives or what have you. And so if you show a rubric, like if this is the criteria for getting a 1, let's say, and you can show the student what they wrote and that they are meeting criteria for 1, but if they want to get a 5, here are the things that you have to do. And it's almost like a checklist of things that they need to include in their writing in order to meet the criteria and get the grade that they would like.
That's a great point. And those rubrics, for some of our kids, it may be beneficial to provide a little bit more information than a typical rubric.
Right.
So an overall rubric for an essay for an English class in high school may be like a short paragraph that summarized, free of punctuation mistakes, good vocabulary use, this kind of thing. But a rubric for some of our kiddos may be more beneficial to really write out. It needs to be 6 sentences. Each sentence needs to include these certain types of modifiers. Right. It needs to include this number of references to the text. Really, really explicit
Much more
and
concrete.
clear. Yeah, absolutely.
I like that. So we're going to move on to math supports. And I know that we mentioned this briefly in our first webcast, but one of the things that we should really do is pre-assess a student's mathematical ability, because math builds so much from one year to the next. We really want to make sure where that their understanding is. And so if they know a concept, don't make them keep doing it. So, I think about timed multiplication, those 1-minute drills that I had when I was in school. And I figure, okay, fluency is great, but for a student who can do that and can get them all correct in a minute the first time, having them do it every day is going to cause some anxiety and some frustration. So, really understand what their mathematical ability is. And where's that breakdown? So are they able to multiply fractions? Okay, great. So then we don't have to spend time there. We can move on and figure out where we need to support the student. Some of the conceptual pieces of math, when we have math and we also include reading and that comprehension piece, sometimes that's where things kind of fall apart. So those story problems and having visual support to understand what some of these words mean, and that in sum actually means equal. And if you have some sort of visual support so that a student knows, when I see these words, I know that this means this, and they can actually write what the equation is without really paying attention to all the words in that story problem. So using a multidisciplinary and interactive approach is really a good idea. So there are lots of hands-on programs for math, one of them being Touch Math, really putting that visual piece to understanding numbers, using manipulatives so that number sense is developed. And early on in elementary school, sometimes kids can count to a gazillion, but they don't understand that one-to-one correspondence, that if I have one gummy bear, that equals the number 1, or that idea that one cookie split in half is still one cookie. So really showing them with manipulatives and visual supports can really provide that, making things more concrete instead of that abstract piece of things.
And for older students that may be a little turned off by kind of pulling out those counting bears or the bright red blocks, there are so many virtual manipulatives on interactive whiteboards like smart boards and Promethean boards, as well as iPads that can look like just a typical device or look like a more interactive activity that can benefit all students, but can really provide that really concrete understanding of what these things mean in addition to just sort of doing them on a worksheet.
Right. Sometimes students might need a little extra time in any subject, but in math also. And so we talk about accommodations and making sure those go back to the IEP and that those things are included so that it kind of reduces that frustration and that trauma perhaps for a student who might need additional time. We can also reduce the number of problems. Like I said, with those 1-minute drills, when there's 50 problems on a page, that's really daunting sometimes. And maybe you just cut off a strip and they have to do that, or the odd numbers or the even numbers, or if they can do a problem and it's correct the first time, maybe they don't have to do 37 other problems in the same. And another piece is calculators. And I know that calculators have become much more advanced, and so you can't assume that a person can automatically understand how to use a calculator. So really teaching how to give them that direct instruction on how to use a calculator and what the process is for that. And sometimes we all need a calculator and we can pull it out on our phone, and that's perfectly acceptable. So we're going to go back to some of those generalization, general organization strategies. And we talked about lists, we talked about organizing, but there are plenty of electronic organizers. And Josh knows lots of apps, far more than I probably do, that really can help a student from elementary school beyond into college, that really don't separate them from their peers, but can really aid in that organization that many of us can do on the fly, but provides that structure and framework for them.
Yeah, for more information about that, check out our previous webcast on using technology to support our students with autism. It has a lot of those approaches to use electronic means of organizing, and
assignment books and calendars are useful, especially when you have some things like a test that's going to be up in 2 weeks, and you have 8 chapters that you have to study for that test. So you can break it down day by day, so that you are addressing the long-term goal with short-term objectives. Graphic organizers, which Josh mentioned before. There are plenty of websites where you can, teachers pay teachers, people have already done them, Pinterest, and you can download these wonderful ideas, but make sure that it's something that a student feels is useful and that they actually will be using and they would like to use. If you give them a graphic organizer and they're not interested in it, or they think it wouldn't be helpful, then they're not going to use it and it's not going to be successful. Some of the strategies using some of the evidence-based practices that we know so well, but breaking tasks like a task analysis, something that's very large into those bite-sized pieces that are more workable and obtainable. Providing checkpoints with long-term projects. So as a teacher, you may give a due date that's a month out, and with many of your students that's sufficient, but you might need to do some check-ins a little bit more periodically with our kiddos so that they're accountable and you know that they're monitoring their progress and they are actually working towards that long-term goal. Providing time to actually organize materials and assignments is important. So if you give a student, at the beginning of the school year, you get all your books and your materials, but they need some time and some assistance in learning how to best organize for them. Sometimes I like to color code things. So maybe a student has a folder for math that's green, and they have a notebook that's green. And on their book, they have a sticky that's green. So they know that in their planner, if they see green, they need to take all 3 things home with them that night. And that means that they have math homework. So just visual representations to organize their thoughts and their ability to really be successful in the academics. Providing students with a specific location for completed work. I know kids who absolutely they do their homework, it's always done, but they continue to fail. And it's failing because even on their tests they get 100%, but they're not turning in their work because they forget to. So providing a visual support for them that is maybe a remember to turn in your homework, or a reminder on their phone, or a specific place in the classroom that they know when they come in, that's the first place that they need to go. And so it's in their visual sight, and that's part of their routine. And making it part of the routine so that they can turn in their work and not end up getting tons of zeros. One of the final things that we'll talk about is really looking at a student's learning style. So we talk about visual supports all the time, but sometimes we need to think beyond that. So sometimes there's kinesthetic ways of teaching that really gets a student up and moving and understanding more of those abstract concepts in a more meaningful way. So really being thoughtful about how you're teaching and using different teaching strategies to support a student's learning. When possible, using those real life examples. It's, we talked about the abstractness of things, but if you can make it meaningful to the student and make it about them or about real life things that are important to them, whether it's their special interest or something that's relative to what's happening in their life, that is really a useful strategy. We talked about those rubrics, and like Josh said, making them much more specific is probably a great idea. You can also sit down with a student and make a rubric together so that they know what those expectations are as you're building the rubric, so that they know that, okay, I do need to have these number of sentences, and do you understand? Yes, that's going to be 5. I get a 5 if I do this number of sentences. So it's not a piece of paper that is just one more thing that they have to address or adhere to. Probably my favorite is if they can do 3 problems, don't make them do 30. It's often seen as a waste of time for them and can really exacerbate behaviors. So keep that in mind.
The 2 that really jump out at me from this list, Staci, are offering choices that fit students' learning style.
Right.
And I think teachers tend to be much more organized as a group of individuals than certainly the average group of folks out there. And so I think, teachers tend to have an idea in their head of what organization looks like that often it isn't really compatible with
Right.
the way that students see their own organization, or that students pull out, salient information. So, a beautifully color-coded, tabbed folder may be great for some students, and it may be what worked for that teacher when they were in school, being a successful student that was able to self-manage and things like that. But for some students, that's just never going to work. They don't, the students don't buy into whatever that specific set of strategies are. So providing lots of choices is really, really important, and working with students to find what works for them.
Mm-hmm.
I had one student that went through the color coding, a file folder, all these different things, and the strategy that ended up working for them is just everything got dumped in one place, nothing got lost, and then there was a specific time where that organization process could happen. But until that organization process happened, no organization happened in the middle of math class or between classes or anything like that. It just went in what we called the dump. And the dump got sorted out later on in the day, but things never got lost, and there was a time and a place where that organization could
That's
happen
great.
with a little more support. So I think it's really, really key to find what works for that student, providing
Right.
choices, and for older students getting their buy-in into it.
Absolutely.
So they're going to do it. The best strategy is one that they do.
Exactly.
So, well, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you found some useful strategies. For more information on a lot of the topics that we've touched on, go check out more on our website, vcuautismcenter.org. We have a lot of information on other related topics like social skills, behavioral supports, using technology, and some of our previous webcasts and seminars. So I'm Josh Taylor.
And we have those how-tos, so some of these things that you might not have quite understood, we have some how-tos on how to do those pretty quick and easy.
Perfect.
And I'm Staci Carr. Thank you so much.